Hello and welcome to the Thompson Dunn YouTube channel. This is the third webinar in our series of three that we have run over the last couple of weeks and months. This one is called Transformational Change, Listening to Your Intuition. Some key insights from myself and colleagues Pat Thompson and Deanna Franculescu. We hope you enjoy the recording of the session and hope that you can join us for a live webinar in the future. But in the meantime, enjoy and we hope to see you soon. Today, we'll do a little bit of revisiting of material that we've talked about on our first two webinars, focusing around change and transition, looking at the change curve and how that relates to the topic really under the microscope today, which is intuition. And we'll be looking at some of the science behind intuition in terms of what it actually is, where it comes from, and how it can be useful to us when faced with scenarios of transformational change or transition. And we'll be looking at instinct and intuition as being vehicles for transformation, both internal and external. And all will become apparent as we move through the slides. So let's just go back and recap the stuff we've done on the previous webinars around the curve of change and what that means for us on an individual level in the external world and also on the internal world. And for those of you who've seen this before, I apologize, but for those who haven't, this is quite a well-used and really quite useful model for understanding change and the effect it has on us individually in terms of performance and morale, but also the discrepancy between what we expect to happen in terms of the impact of change and what happens to us over time and what actually happens in reality. So the red line would be more of an expected kind of change. So less deep in terms of its impact on our performance and morale, but also happening quicker, where in reality, the depth of that influence of changing circumstance and the reality that it has on us is actually a lot deeper and also takes a lot more time to work through. And with intuition and transformational change, we move it away from change as a concept, which is predominantly an external process, and think about it more in terms of transition, which is an internal psychological shift. We can accept when things to some extent change in our surroundings, but in order to get comfortable with that change, it requires an internal psychological shift, which happens very deep in our primordial brain and in our instinct and in our intuition, where we feel more comfortable with what we're facing in terms of change. And that leads us on to the topic of discussion today, which is our intuition. So intuition, big topic, really difficult topic because it is so nebulous, I think, for all of us. However, a lot of research has been done over the years to understand intuition, and I wanted to present some of that to you today in terms of what it is, how it's defined, and how we experience intuition in our lives. And I will make an apology here. Some of the slides are a little more wordy and contentful than I would otherwise like, usually to produce. But I took the view that it would be silly for me to try and redact and simplify some quite insightful commentary from some of the most renowned and preeminent researchers and psychologists that have ever lived. I don't want to change their words for the purposes of a simple slide. So we're going to be looking at some definitions here. And we start with Jung talking about intuition as a sort of additional form of perception. It's outside cognitive function and outside of our reasoning. And it should be considered whenever the rational or established methodologies that we have developed, either in our own brains or in our societies to deal with change and to deal with issue, don't work. And I think there's probably a lot of analysis and commentary and interpretation of what we could be looking at the moment with the clearly worldwide changing circumstances and transformations we're all having to make. And I like this phrase, it lurks in our unconsciousness. And it's like, and as he quite profoundly puts, and it's absolutely my experience, where I know something, but I don't know why I know or how I know that. And intuition, therefore, seems to have a preeminent voice for me in terms of understanding what I'm facing. Some of the additional research on top of Jung's definitions came from Vaughan, and she was talking about it being non-rational, so making that point again, and being quite an immediate and distinct, quite speedy and efficient way of perceiving something, and it happening in our unconscious processing of that information. So then I thought, well, we've got some definitions, but it's probably quite smart and quite reasonable to have a think about where it actually comes from. And in putting these slides together, I was thinking, leveraging a lot of my experience and my learning over the years to think about it in the terms of the origins of the mind. I was talking to a sports psychologist friend of mine recently, and he was talking about sports people being in the bubble and being in the zone and when they're really performing at their peak. And that isn't about technical capability or anything to do with the skills and talent that they've honed through practice and performance in game scenarios over the years. It's actually to do with the fact that their minds, all of our minds, are built for survival and not built for performance. And when we are actually performing at the peak of our capabilities, we're working with our instinctual capabilities rather than our tech capabilities. And I've got a good story about an ex-cricketer that I once worked with, and I'll maybe tell that in the wash-up at the end. These days, we like to think the primordial threat to life has been curtailed, and clearly at the moment we are experiencing something that is perhaps making us realize that we haven't been able to control everything to the point where primordial threat is no longer the case. But in more normal times, threat to professional performance, our self-esteem, those things still remain, and that's when our survival instinct and potentially our intuition kick in. Whether we listen to it or not is another moot point, and we'll be visiting that in a moment. So that's the point. The threat becomes apparent when we face change. Something in our world is changing either internally and externally. We build in that survival instinct to how we respond, or at least we should and could do that better than we maybe do currently. And the reasoning behind all of that is it affects our ability to transform our world. And if we don't incorporate our non-logical reasoning skill, our instinctual analysis of, we're probably diminishing our ability to cope with and deal with that changing circumstance. So just building on what I've talked about so far, this modern brain is quite an interesting concept. It's this rational, objective frontal cortex, which has been built and has evolved over the many thousands of years that we've been on this planet. And it's responsible for the things that I've listed there: memory and problem solving, rational and judgment type responses to the world in which we live. The primal brain is the subjective hindbrain, and that's responsible for that survival, that drive, and that instinct stuff we were talking about on the previous slide. When that's engaged, the frontal cortex isn't working as much, so your instinct and intuition are lead response to the changing circumstances that you face. So, with that quite logical analysis, it's reasonable to suggest that the instinctive brain, from a purely biological and psychological perspective, may provide us with some answers when we're faced with change. It's certainly going to be important when we're trying to achieve ecological transition and with transformational change. And the comment there is we should at least try to leverage and accommodate our intuitive capacity, because the result in our analysis, in the research, and in our experience is that the flow of ideas and level of performance could be greatly enhanced. And that's the sporting example I was giving earlier. The guy I was talking to was saying, some of the top sports people that he's worked with really can only point to scenarios where they were in that zone of instinctual response, maybe 5 to 10 times in their career, but they were at the absolute peak of their performance because their hindbrain and their modern brain were working so well in tandem, help them deal with the changing circumstances that a sports person has to deal with whenever they're in a particular game or in a particular scenario. Having those in harmony and in a perfect marriage allows performance and process and transition to flow extremely readily. So, onto why is intuition useful? Well, some of our clients who are familiar with decision profile, perhaps licensees, will hopefully have seen this research by Dana Pratt and Sinclair and Ashkenazi. I promised myself I would learn the pronunciation of Ashkenazi before today's webinar. And again, I didn't want to redact too much because they talk beautifully about how intuition helps us to lead us to understanding things and understand underlying meaning. And if we remember the change curve from the start, I might back to it at the end just to point this out, but finding meaning happens on the upturn of the curve when we've got to the reality of our changing circumstance and started to make an understanding of the meaning of what that changing circumstance actually means for us. So that intuitive piece can move you through that curve of change and transition yourself psychologically quicker by incorporating our instinct and intuition. The bigger picture focus being incredibly useful for vision in numerous work and life related scenarios. But we perhaps see it most readily in our social circumstances, although we don't have as many as we normally would prefer potentially at the moment with lockdown restrictions. But we get an instinctive and intuitive reaction to what's going on in the room or between a particular dynamic, and that's usually happening for a reason. It's our hindbrain screaming at us that we can interpret this situation or this social interaction quicker. We might not know why we feel that way, but it's certainly giving us some information that we should probably be listening to. And a huge amount of management literature has highlighted this speed and efficiency point around intuition. And it's been analyzed to be an incredibly good and successful guide to critical time-sensitive decisions. And is often the case in a lot of the work I do with financial organizations, that it's their intuitive decision making that prevails rather than the logical and the rational. And intuition, again, is something that this research, our experience, and our analysis would suggest is going to be key to helping us navigate change and to psychologically transition. And I love this quote. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And that was our old friend Charles Darwin. So you might be thinking, why have I put this on a slide? But there is a large elephant in the room, despite all of this research and experience and intellectual understanding around this concept of intuition. Over the years, we've been gathering a lot of information and data around intuition through our decision profile population. And my colleague Deanna in particular has helped me and Pat and I enormously with some data analysis on this concept of intuition. If we look at our whole data set, we see that 10% of our population report themselves as being conscious processors. And another phrase for that is non-intuitive decision makers, maintaining a very conscious rather than unconscious prefrontal cortex decision making style. Whereas 90% of the population, if we had 25 and 65 together, 90% of the population report as being intuitive, but only 25% of the population incorporate and use their intuition in their decision and quite often in their thinking and problem solving. This was really interesting to find in our data set because we found that this was also backed up by quite comprehensive research by Peavy and Thornton. Exactly the same. Approximately 25% of Peavy's sample were intuitives, i.e. incorporating and using their intuition. Another bit that we need to maybe look at is there a gender difference between females and males in terms of intuitive capacity and incorporation? Well, our data set would say no, they're busted. They're broadly the same, both in terms of distribution of conscious processing preferences versus intuitive preferences versus incorporating and intuitive. And the majority of the population are in this white part of these pie charts, which are reporting intuition, but not incorporating and using that intuition in their decision making. What about generational differences? Well, Deanna did some really interesting research recently on this and looked at 3 different sort of generational categories: baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials. And we see quite an interesting pie chart there on the right-hand side around the extent to which people are intuitive and incorporating, intuitive or not incorporating, or conscious processing. And we can speculate and make commentary on this, but it is really quite fascinating how it seems as you get future generations, or current and then future generations, perhaps how much more reliant we are on our prefrontal modern brain than we maybe are on our intuitive and instinctual brain. I can speak a little bit on top of that, in terms of my understanding of the education systems predominantly in the UK, but also have colleagues and friends around the world who maybe would back this up. That certainly my experience, even though I went to very good schools, universities as well, there seems to be an increasing focus on that prefrontal cortex understanding of topics, subjects, experiences, and less on that instinctive, creative, potentially right brain, we would describe it. Certainly in education, I think there's a pressure to come out with a degree that allows you to go and become an accountant or whatever it may be. And we almost suppress and deny that hindbrain stuff we were talking about. And maybe that's impacting the millennials' analysis. I'm not 100% sure, but I would suggest it's probably part. And just to finish on this data analysis, we looked at different cohorts of seniority and found quite a marked difference between lower and middle management sectors of leadership versus senior management and director president level. And again, we could look at that. Maybe Pat, you could jump in. We were talking about that earlier on. You got any insight onto why this might be?
It's an observation, really, just from experience. I can talk about it because the company doesn't exist anymore, and we might hypothesize as to why. I did a lot of work for ICI, which is an old chemical company that existed for 100 years and then died, basically found great difficulty in getting products to market, interestingly. But what I observed on the plant, where there were production people with an expectation of lower level of skill, in other words, they were just doing what they were told to do, and it was quite a hierarchical organization. Most of the people who were working on the plant left their brains at the door when they came in the morning, or left their creative brains when they came in the morning, and did the most amazing things outside of the workplace. And in a way, that was what was expected of them in a very traditional organization, which hopefully we've learned a little bit from that over the years, that that's not really a very intelligent way of engaging with people who have actually got good ideas and which might help you to improve the working situation or improve the way you do things at work. But it was an observation that, in fact, they had lots of intuition, but they just took it elsewhere to the company's detriment, to be honest. That was my only observation. And clearly, for those of us who are into leadership development and wanting to, whether we own a company or whether we work in a company and we're a manager or whatever the situation, we want to try and help people. And that's been very much a source of what I've done, or what I hope I've done over the years with Thompson Dunn, is actually to help people to transition into being accepted for being able to be a disruptor, if you like, somebody who can actually bring their intellect, and not just their structured intellect, but their intuition and their intellect into how they can become better leaders, better managers, better workforce, full stop. It doesn't matter really if you do something intelligently. It doesn't matter whether you're cleaning the toilet or whether you're the managing director. You might as well do it intelligently, is my view.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pat. Let's move through and go to, so what can we draw from this? So what can we draw from this? As I say, I looked around for all sorts of things, and I thought, well, Maslow typically sums up things pretty good on a lot of topics. So let's check out what Maslow had to say. And his stuff is brilliant on this. I encourage you to go and read Maslow's interpretation of intuition. He talks about it being innate and intrinsic to the human psyche. In fact, I'm going to put these all down just so you can drink them in. There's no point me just reading them to you, but clearly there's an association with creativity intrinsic to our human psyche, and also its relation to that self-actualizing person looking for spontaneity and ease, and not being concerned with absolute truth or a correct answer. Maslow also brilliantly talks about intuition and its suppression in a theory about denial. And this is kind of what Pat and I were having a really interesting discussion about fear and how intuition and instinct can help us in those scenarios. And again, maybe we'll leave that to the end just so we're not going to be running too long on the slides. But suppressing intuition, beautifully put there, or creativeness out of fear of knowing themselves or to avoid identifying personal areas of development. Prefrontal, logical, rational, objective cortex overtaking the hindbrain. Similar to rational versus non-rational thought processes and minimizing the acknowledgement of intuition and decision making. And this is beautiful. People take the path of least resistance typically. They conform to rational norms and thought processes that are objective and acceptable to the majority. And this is, status quo decision making, a common and sometimes dominant response, because suppressed instinct and intuition is unhealthy, unwise, and can cause a serious problem when we are faced with the broader topic of these 3 webinars, change and transformation. So draw some conclusions before we wrap up the slides and go into a Q&A session. It would seem to us, through the literature and our experience, some great examples today on the webinar from people contributing with scenarios and experiences that they faced, and intuition wasn't incorporated or was misunderstood. It should and could be your friend rather than a foe. It allows us to find meaning where logic might fail. And I just came to me, who'd have thought that your hindbrain might actually lead you more effectively than your modern prefrontal cortex? I think that's a really interesting thing to consider, that we have survived as a species, not because we've always known how to read, write, reason logically and count those things. We've survived because of our instinct and our ability to intuit the scenarios that we face. But surely our survival should be something that we think about and learn from. Back to the point about them being primordial in their roots and how they are immensely valuable, and because they're the most natural human reasoning powers. And the conclusion is that intuition and instinct can be the vehicles for leading ourselves through transformational change. And it's certainly been an enormous resource for me in my own experience of changing circumstances, not least this lockdown. And I think this beautiful quote from Rumi, there is a voice that doesn't use words, listen. Thank you for your attention during these slides. Look out for a number of things that we have coming up, virtual leadership programs, a virtual creativity workshop which Pat is putting together, and also check out Decision Profile, understand a little bit more about your own intuitive capacity.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that session. Some really interesting stuff in there. Quite a difficult topic again, trying to talk about intuition and transformation. Concepts and issues that I think are very personal and therefore quite difficult to talk in general terms, but some really interesting stats, some really interesting data around incorporation and utilization of intuition in decision making and how we lead our lives in general and how we go about shaping our future. So I hope you enjoyed the content and it stimulated some thoughts. We'd love to, as I said earlier, welcome you. If you're not a person who's participated yet, welcome you to join us on future webinars. Please stay in touch with this channel. Contact us at info@thompsondunn.com. Follow us on our social media channels on Twitter and on our websites, thompsondunn.com and decisionprofile.com. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get together and do some work with you. So please stay in touch. And if you have any questions or queries, you know where we are. Thank you again, and we hope to see you all again soon.